We're going to go now to the Greek world, and we're going to deal with the most important Greek hero, the figure of Herakles, which is more commonly known in modern society by the Roman name Hercules. Okay, the original name was Herakles, and there's a reason for that. It actually means something in Greek. We'll talk about what that means later. But the Latin form, I don't think really had much significance. It was a great character, and this is really the greatest of the Greek heroes. This is the character that is the most well-known of the Greek heroes. You have more stories told about Herakles than any other Greek hero. Now, it might not be encapsulated in a wonderful epic the way the story of Achilles is in the Iliad by Homer, but you've got lots of different people writing about Herakles, different appearances of Herakles in stories of other great heroes. We'll see that later when we go into Story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, for instance. He's instrumental in that story, at least for a portion of the story. But there were lots of stories that were circulating about Herakles, and eventually some of these stories are compiled into almost a codified version of the Hercules story, focusing mainly on what are called the 12 Labors of Heracles. And in your textbook, what you should have read for today's lecture is essentially the story of the 12 labors. And it's very brief. Your textbook doesn't spend a lot of time on the story of Herakles, so I am going to give you more of the original story. Okay, so let's take a look at Herakles, and here is the translation of the name for you in the subtitle. Glory of Hera. That's actually what the word means. You can see the word Hera, or the name Hera, right there in his name. The K-L-E-S, Kleis, is from the word kleos, which means glory. We studied that word before. It's one of the main motivations of heroes that fight for glory, fame, reputation. Okay, the thing that survives of you after you die. And that's what ultimately Herakles is going to obtain by the end of the story, because like many of the other heroes we've talked about, he is going to meet an unfortunate end, a tragic demise at the end of the story. So why don't we dive in and take a look at the greatest of the Greek heroes. So the statue here is actually a wonderful, wonderful piece. This is, if I'm remembering correctly, I think I took this photo myself. I've got a number of photos of it. This is in the museum in Naples, Italy. This is the Farnese Herakles. It's a giant marble. You guys could tell the difference, I think. Marble statue of the hero Herakles. Now, I don't know if I pointed out artwork from the Greeks before, but the key to identifying a figure in Greek art is not to look at their physical presence, right? You can't really tell by looking at this face whether you're looking at Zeus, Poseidon, Herakles, or some other generic bearded hero. You can't even tell by the musculature. I know Herakles is a big, strong guy, but so is Zeus. The only way you can tell who it is by looking at the things that they're carrying. So you can notice on his left arm, or under his left arm, is a club, and draped over the club is a lion skin. Those are the giveaways. If you see a figure in art wearing a lion skin or carrying a lion skin, carrying a club, this will be Herakles. The other weapon that he has, which you can see in this little graphic over on the left, is a bow and arrow. Those are his main weapons, the club and the bow and arrow. We're going to talk about how he uses them in the story, but let's do a little bit of a background. Not a background so much for the culture of the ancient Greeks, because we've already dealt with Prometheus. I've talked a little bit about Greek history. So the hero Herakles is one of the oldest of the Greek heroes, and we don't know where he originated, where these stories originally came from, but if you consult the historian Herodotus, the father of history, he'll say that Herakles probably came from ancient Egypt or Canaan, which means even in his time he realized there were parallels to Herakles in other mythologies of the ancient Near East. Now, one could immediately think Gilgamesh at this point, and there are actually scenes in the stories of Herakles where he does some of the very same feats that Gilgamesh does. So most likely, Herodotus is thinking Gilgamesh when he is saying Herakles originated in the Near East. So he may be just a Greek version or a Greek adaptation of Gilgamesh, though I don't think it's quite that simple, because he is very, very Greek in his own way and has some very unique stories as well. If we're going to put him into a historical setting, we'll put him back around the 13th century BC. This is the Bronze Age, the Mycenaean era, about a generation or so prior to the war at Troy. Right? The Trojan heroes are the last generation of heroes in the heroic age. The character of Herakles and a lot of his contemporaries are generally the fathers of the heroes that go to Troy. Okay, so about 13th century BC, and there are plenty of stories, like I said, where you have mention of Herakles, starting way back with Homer, right? 8th century BC, this is our earliest writing from the Greek world. This is the great epic, Iliad, Odyssey, produced by Homer. Homer refers to Herakles, kind of in passing, so that you would be expected to know who he's talking about, which definitely tells us that Homer's audience, when he was writing, would have already known very much about Herakles, right? Kind of a household name even by that time. Now, throughout the rest of the Archaic period on into the Roman period, you continue to have lots of stories written about him. And I should even say, after the end of the Roman era, even into the Middle Ages, Herakles is going to be a presence in Christian literature, medieval literature, and on up through the modern day. He's never really disappeared, not like Gilgamesh did. He's been an enduring figure, and that's basically because Greek and Roman civilization was really the stuff that lay right behind Western civilization as it developed, whereas, ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, not so much. The 2nd century AD, there's a work produced called Bibliotheke, or the library, often attributed to Apollodorus. So you may see it written down somewhere as the library by Apollodorus. The writer Apollodorus actually lived much earlier than this. Contemporary, people date this work to. So he probably lived, maybe 400 years prior to the writing of this work. So most likely we don't, not most likely, we don't know who wrote this thing. But what it was a collection of stories that was kind of like an encyclopedia of mythology for the most part, right? That's what a library is. And in it, he talks about the 12 labors of Heracles. Now, when we get to the 12 labors in a second, I'm going to give you a particular list of the 12. There are lots of different lists of the 12 labors. Now, it's hard to come up with a definitive list, but we'll just assume this is the closest we have to a definitive list. And the reason you can have so many variations is because he has so many adventures. One author might just substitute a different adventure into the list of 12. But anyways, let's not stay there too long. Let's move on and talk about the stories. Plural, right? They got a lot of stories. Let's talk about Mycenae. This is, like I said, prior to the time of the great king Agamemnon and the Trojan War. But the heirs of Mycenae, the kings of Mycenae, a dynasty by the name of the Perseids. Now, Perseids, that family, comes from the great hero Perseus. So if you've seen, obviously you've already referred to in the text here, some of you are fans of the Percy Jackson series. That's where the name Percy comes from, a play on Perseus, the great hero, who is the central figure in another movie called The Clash of the Titans, which again kind of butchers ancient Greek mythology, but is a fun movie nonetheless. Anyways, Perseus is one of the older generations of heroes. He's, generations prior even to Herakles. And he ends up becoming king of Mycenae, and you have his children. Now, Perseus, by the way, it's kind of important to the narrative, was a son of Zeus, right? Zeus slept with the princess Danae. She gives birth to Perseus, and then she is cast out with this child by the grandfather. He does his adventures, slays the Gorgon Medusa, eventually comes back home and becomes king of Mycenae. Okay, so we're not really dealing with his story. But anyways, Electron, if I'm remembering my genealogy correctly, Electron would be a son or grandson of Perseus. I think it's his son. Now, Electron is where we're going to pick up the story. And I don't think they talk about him in your textbook, but he's king of Mycenae, and he has a daughter by the name of Alcmena. And then he has a nephew by the name of Amphitryon. Now, Amphitryon is betrothed, to use a fancy term for engaged, to his daughter Alcmena, and he stands to be the new heir to the kingdom. When after they're married, when Electron passes on, or at least passes on the throne, it's going to go to Amphitryon. You see this very often in Greek mythology, where the daughter is the key to the throne. It's going to say the same thing in the story of Troy with Helen of Sparta. Anyways, there's another figure by the name of Sthenelus, who is the uncle. This is another brother of Electron. Now, what happens in the story is there is a war, Electron with his neighboring kingdom. And what happens in the midst of this war is Electron's sons, the brothers of Alcmena, are killed in the combat, and the enemies make off with the cattle of Electron. Okay, now these cattle, which are now missing, are very, very valuable. You know, a herd of cattle, I mean, the cattle was kind of a measure of one's wealth in the ancient world. And Electryon wants to go off and do two things. He wants to avenge the death of his sons, and he also wants to retrieve his lost cattle, his stolen cattle. So he tells Amphitryon, you reign here at Mycenae in my place while I'm away. And when I come back, we're going to make the marriage official, right? They're only engaged so far, but they're not officially married. Okay, so you're holding the place for me. You're not king, but you're going to rule as regent in my place until I return. Off he goes. Now time passes, and we don't really hear very much from Electryon because he's out trying to avenge the death of his sons and retrieve his cattle. But one day Amphitryon himself goes out into the surrounding region, and he comes across this herd of cattle. And he says, here's the cattle that obviously were stolen. They're wandering here. I'm just going to herd them back to where they belong, you know, and get the job done. Now, it's a large herd of cattle, and you can't really keep them all together very easily. So he sees some cattle off in the distance kind of wandering away from the herd. He picks up a stick or a stone or some kind of heavy object, and he, being a fairly powerful man himself, throws the thing all the way across the herd of cattle to the other side to kind of spook the animals and cause them to just kind of group up together a little bit. Now, what he doesn't notice, of course, is that Electryon himself is on the other end of the field, and he's been herding the cattle back home himself. And what happens, tragically, is the rock or the stick or whatever it was strikes Electryon, and he accidentally kills the king. Now, when you kill somebody, that brings blood guilt. It brings a pollution. It brings a contamination. You're responsible for bloodshed. You need to be purified. You need to pay some type of penance, whether it's intentional or not. That's very important, religiously speaking. Now, the other big problem, of course, is that he's not officially married to Alcmena, and he's going to have to, do this penance. But Alcmena says, okay, in the meantime, actually, they go away. Here's where Sthenelus comes in. I don't want to skip over that. So because Amphitryon has shed blood, killed the previous king, even by accident, he needs to go into exile, and he goes with Alcmena away from Mycenae, and the brother, Sthenelus, the uncle, steps in and becomes king of Mycenae. Now, he's going to be important in a second because his son is going to be really important in the story of Herakles, but Sthenelus is going to be the new king of Mycenae. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and let's follow Amphitryon and Alcmena. She basically says, I'm not going to marry you officially or sleep with you or allow you to touch me until you finish what my father has started. He may have retrieved the cattle and the cattle are back, but my brothers have not yet been avenged. You need to go off on this mission, this quest. So here's his call to adventure. Go off, avenge the death of my brothers, and then I will marry you. And Amphitryon agrees. He goes off and leaves Alcmena home alone. And while he's away, enter the character whose picture I have up on the screen. This is Zeus. Now, of course, you couldn't tell that it's Zeus because you don't see anything that he's holding. This is actually a wonderful statue if you guys are familiar with bronze, some classical era bronze sculpture. This dates to about middle of the 5th century BC. It's a bronze statue, previously thought to be the god Poseidon. And by the way, we don't have very many bronze statues from the ancient world because bronze was very valuable and was often melted down by later generations. Particularly after the fall of the Roman Empire. But this statue is preserved because it was found in a shipwreck and was brought up. And originally, basically because it was found in the water, people started to call it the Poseidon. The identification today by many is that it was probably Zeus. You really can't tell because his hands are empty, but he is in a pose where he would have been holding something in his right hand, which is up behind him. If he was holding a trident, then it would be a statue of Poseidon. If he's holding a lightning bolt, which is most likely what he was holding because there are plenty of vase paintings that show Zeus in this very pose holding a lightning bolt or a thunderbolt, then it would be clearly the god of the heavens, Zeus himself. So I think it's Zeus. Anyways, that's the character I'm about to talk about. So along comes Zeus. Let's talk about this before I reveal the slide. You know about Zeus's favorite pastime, which is seducing just about anybody he has a fancy for. Man, woman, child, animal. Doesn't really matter. He is not very discerning when it comes to his tastes. And he sees a beautiful woman by the name of Alcmena all by herself, unprotected, and there's his opportunity. He's going to disguise himself, come to visit her, and sleep with her. Now, the disguise he picks, I have to say, is the best one he has used in mythology. I mean, sometimes he shows up in the form of a bull. Don't quite know how that works. Sometimes he shows up in the size, in the form of a swan or some kind of animal. I don't know how any of that works. But here he comes in the form of Amphitryon. How appropriate. So along comes a knock on the door, and Alcmene opens the door and says, "You're back." And he says, "Yes, I avenged the death of your brothers." And he goes ahead and tells her the whole story, and she's very impressed with him. And then they sleep together. And because he's Zeus, he makes the night last for 3 entire days of passionate lovemaking. And of course, also because he's Zeus, he impregnates her. Now, he departs shortly after that. And then, not long after, another knock comes on the door, and here it is, Amphitryon, who finally actually comes home himself. And he starts talking about how he's avenged the death of her brothers, and she's saying, "Didn't you just tell me this whole story a second ago?" But she keeps her mouth shut, and I guess he's excited, so I'm going to just listen to the story again. And then she sleeps with Amphitryon. Of course, the marriage is then sealed, and he, too, being a hero, impregnates her. So she is doubly pregnant. She's going to have twins. Okay, and that's what usually happens in mythology. You very often have a unique birth, and this is the unique birth of Herakles. Though that is not his name, so I'm going to tell you what his actual birth name is very shortly. Now, here's the problem for baby Herakles. Zeus has a jealous wife by the name of Hera. She very often will try to get revenge on not Zeus, but the women or the children involved in these relationships. Really, she really can't punish Zeus himself. He's a little too powerful for that. But unfortunately, the innocents often suffer, and she decides she's going to take it out on Herakles. Now, the way she takes it out is kind of twofold, right? With the birth itself and then right after the birth. So let's first talk about the birth. There's a prophecy that Zeus utters in the story. It's very vague, and prophecies are always vague. So he says, he's kind of bragging as it gets 9 months into the pregnancy. Alcmene is about to give birth to the baby, and he's up on Olympus bragging about, today a descendant of mine is going to be born that will become the great king, great hero, and king of, many people. Now, Hera overhears the bragging, of course. He's not hiding it by any means. And it's very vague when he refers to this child being born as kind of a descendant. He doesn't say his literal son, but a descendant of his, somebody from his loins. And she realizes if she can prevent the birth of this child at the moment, which she does, she blocks the birth, so Alcmene does not give birth on that day. She then goes and speeds up the birth of another woman who happens to be pregnant. She's not quite ready to give birth, but again, she's going to give birth prematurely. It happens to be the wife of Sthenelus, who is currently king of Mycenae. Now, Sthenelus happens to be a son of Perseus, who happens to be a son of Zeus. So Sthenelus' son will fulfill the prophecy. Okay, there's always that loophole. So Sthenelus' son is going to be the character, I can't believe I forgot the name. Eurystheus. Yeah, there it is. Comes back. Eurystheus. Now, Eurystheus is a pathetic character in the story of Herakles, but he's nonetheless going to be king of Mycenae, fulfilling the prophecy. Whereas poor Herakles, who is supposed to be the fulfillment of the prophecy, gets born a little bit later, and he's going to be kind of a nobody, at least in comparison to Eurystheus. That's one part of the revenge. But to make things even worse, Hera is then going to attempt to kill this poor child by sending these serpents. And this is what Disney did get into the movie. Of course, it wasn't Hera. Do you guys remember who it was that sends the serpents to kill baby Herakles in the Disney movie? Those that have seen the Disney movie? This is always the bad guy in Hollywood's version of Greek mythology. It's never Hera, but it's Hades. Good. Yeah. Hades is not the bad guy in this story. Hera is. She sends the serpents and into the crib where the two babies are sleeping. And Amphitryon and Alcmene hear the crying and come into the room. And of course, it's not Herakles that's crying, it's his brother, whose name happens to be Iphicles. I didn't give you the name of Herakles, but his name is actually Alcides. I don't know if I do that on the next slide, but in case I didn't, it's baby Alcides and baby Iphicles. Iphicles is crying his head off because obviously he's not the son of Zeus, and Herakles is strangling the serpents because he is the son of Zeus. And I think, the whole jig was up at that point because I think Amphitryon realized this probably was not his son that's doing this feat. But again, you get a glimpse of the greatness and the power, even as a baby, that Heracles has. Okay. Good job. Another guess for Hades. All right, so, here it is. I did include a picture not a picture, but a slide, along with a wonderful picture of a Roman-era statue showing a baby Heracles with the serpent that he's strangling. This is really a wonderful work of art. Anyways, there's a lot of versions of this piece out there. So the twin boys, Iphicles and Alcides, there are the names for you so that you don't forget. And here's the problem with young Alcides. Actually, the problem with the entire story of Heracles. He has a self-control issue. He's got an anger problem. He doesn't know how to manage his temper. And this is going to manifest itself over and over and over again throughout his life, and it's going to cause him all kinds of suffering, which is very important. The first story I'm going to give you actually takes place while he was pretty young, before he becomes a real hero. And it has to do with the guy by the name of Linus. Linus is Alcides' music teacher. To be a good Greek, you needed to be trained not only in warfare and combat and athletics and stuff like that, but also the arts. Playing in the music, singing, poetry. The lyre would have been the instrument that he's learning in this story. And Heracles is just really not very good at that particular task. And as he's trying to play the instrument, he starts getting frustrated. And if any of you have ever taken lessons in music or tried to learn an instrument, in the beginning, I'm pretty sure you were like myself. It was difficult and even frustrating. And you have a temptation to just put it away and give up. Well, he doesn't throw the instrument. He goes off into a rage, and he strikes Linus with the lyre in his anger, not realizing again how powerful he is. He kills the guy with a single blow. Accidental, but nonetheless, because of his anger, he's guilty. He's shed blood. He needs to pay penalty. He needs to go off and be purified. Again, death is a pollution. This is something you don't want to come in contact with. There's all kinds of religious requirements from religions all over the world about what needs to be done when you touch a dead body or come into contact with death or blood or something along those lines. He's sent off to Thebes. The city of Thebes is where he does service to the king. And in the process, he starts to become a hero. He does a number of things. He fights in the army with the Theban soldiers. He kills his first lion in those years. And then the king is so grateful that he gives Alcides his daughter Megara as his bride. Here's the name that comes into the Disney movie, Meg, right? That's his wife in the Disney cartoon. Well, Megara is married to Alcides. They're happy together. They have a number of boys, number of children together. And this is too happy a story for Hera, who's back there watching and still waiting for her vengeance. So she decides to mess up the whole situation by sending insanity upon Alcides. Now, insanity, when it's present in a story like this, is always sent by the gods. It's always some kind of divine possession, almost a demonic possession. But at the same time, the individual possessed is somehow responsible for what they do while they're possessed. And they literally are blind. They don't realize what they're doing. There's an illusion that comes over them. I don't know if I talked to you guys about Zeus and Kronos. Kronos, went into a panic and swallowed all of his children to avoid the prophecy of him being overthrown. It's kind of this moment of blindness. He's able to even swallow a rock. The baby Zeus, was saved, and a rock was replaced him. But in this instance, he thinks he's being attacked by some thieves or robbers or something like that, and turns and kills what apparently are these marauders. Ends up, when he comes to, realizing this was his children and his wife. He kills his entire family, right? They don't do this in the Disney cartoon, right? He doesn't kill Linus. He definitely doesn't kill Meg, right? You have a happily ever after in Disney, but in the story, he kills his first wife and all of his children, and he's absolutely distraught and devastated when he realizes what he's done, okay? And then he goes off for penance, and he goes to the place known as Delphi. Delphi is the main shrine for prophetic inspiration in the Greek world. This was a place on Mount Parnassus. It was a sanctuary to Apollo, and the Pythia, who was the priestess at Delphi, assigns him at this time his penance, which are going to be the 12 labors. As a matter of fact, at this moment, she gives him the nickname Herakles, meaning the glory of Hera. And that may be why glory of Hera? I mean, Hera's the one who's out to get him. What does that mean? I mean, you could speculate I think one way you could understand it is, the idea that all of his suffering, everything that he's going to endure for the rest of his life, kind of indicates the power of the goddess, right? She's going to make him go through all of these things. So it's her glory, really, that is manifest in his suffering. That might be one way to look at it. Other scholars have actually suggested that at some point, way in the past, he was probably a hero that was devoted to Hera in some way, definitely associated with her from the very beginning, maybe a servant of Hera's. But whatever it is, the story that we get, he's definitely at odds with her. And, the story is going to be one of suffering. So let's get to the 12 labors. And I'm going to give you them in two groups. You don't need to memorize the 12 labors, but you definitely need to recognize the 12 labors when I give you a test. So this is going to be servitude for 12 years. And I know your textbook says there are 10 labors. He has to do 2 additional labors to bring the number up to 12 because he's disqualified. That is what we get in some accounts, but in general, every account says there were 12 labors, and it probably does have some significance with the number 12, which seems to be one of those numbers that shows up in mythology and religion over and over and over again. May correspond to the 12 months of the year, but it's basically 12 years of servitude to a much lesser man, the guy Eurystheus, who we just talked about, king of Mycenae after his father Sthenelus. And here's a wonderful black figure vase painting showing Herakles carrying the boar that he captured back to Eurystheus, which is one of his labors, and there's Athena right by him. Athena is kind of a god who is a favorite of, or actually, she favors Herakles. What Eurystheus, you can't barely see him in the picture. He's in a jar. You can see his head peeking out and his arms coming out because he is a coward. Every account acknowledges that he is a much lesser man. Right? Here's Herakles serving this guy, and this is a humiliating thing. Right? We just talked about the last session, Rostam, who refused to be put in chains and be subjected to shame and humiliation by going back to see the king. Here is another guy who is willing, Herakles, willing to serve humbly a much lesser individual. And he does this for 12 years. Okay, and this was ultimately going to bring him his glory. Okay, but it is a story about humility and glory. And what I want to draw your attention to, and I'll probably emphasize it again at the end of the lecture, is that unlike most Greek heroes, he is very willing to endure shame and humiliation in the course of his life. Okay, now not consistently because there are lots of different stories, but in general, that's a picture that is unique with Herakles. So let's talk about the first 6 labors. These are going to be called the Greek labors, meaning these labors all take place in the Greek sphere. The second 6 labors are going to be known as I don't give them to you just yet. The second 6 are going to be known as the world labors because those 6 labors take him progressively further and further and further out into the greater world. Okay? Kind of can interpret this as throughout the Greek labors, he goes from being a Greek hero to being a universal hero, a world hero. All right, so let's talk about the Greek labors. The picture there is actually from the second labor, which I'll get to just shortly. So the first labor is the Nemean lion. Now the names associated with each animal or beast, and again, this is clearly a monster slayer type of a hero that you have in Herakles. The name indicates where he does the task for the most part. Nemea, which is near the region of Argos. It's right there at Mycenae, by the way. So we're starting kind of home territory, Nemea. He deals with the Nemean lion. It's a very unique beast in that you can't kill it with a sword or an arrow or anything that pierces its hide because its hide is so impenetrable, it's impossible to pierce. So what he has to do is he strangles the beast with his great strength, and then afterward he cuts the lion's skin off of him, and this becomes his trophy. Now that's an important concept. He's had a victory over a very formidable foe, and the remains of the beast are going to be a constant sign of his greatness because he wears these prominently. That's part of the idea of a trophy is you show it off. It shows how great you are. Now he wears it in a lot of these pictures. You'll see the lion head sitting on his own head, kind of like a helmet where the lion skin kind of draped over his back with the paws tied around his neck. So he doesn't cover very much of his body, but you can imagine it gives him a bit of invulnerability, right? Because it's impenetrable. So here's another hero that has a pseudo-invulnerability built in, but since it doesn't cover everything, you don't really need a weakness. Anyways, how did he get the lion skin off? Well, if it's uncuttable, that would seem to be a trick. What he uses are the lion's own claws, which are the only thing that is able to cut through the hide of the lion. Anyways, that's his first trophy and very important symbol of Herakles. Task 2, he goes to a place known as Lerna. And at Lerna, he fights the Hydra, and that's what you see in the picture, this multi-headed serpent, a dragon. So here's another dragon motif. Herakles is a great dragon slayer, but unlike most dragons, it has multiple heads, and if you cut off a head, 2 more grow back in its place. So he continues to become more and more formidable the longer he fights with these things, so he needs some assistance, and he goes and gets his nephew Laus, who brings a torch, and when Herakles kind of whops off one of the heads, his nephew burns the neck, cauterizes it so that a head doesn't grow back. And eventually he's able to cut off the one final head, which is the immortal head, which he buries under a rock. Now, the side effect of his conquest of the Hydra is able to harvest the blood of the Hydra, the poison venom of the Hydra, which he dips his arrows into. So his bow and arrow, that's going to be his other big tool. And the neat thing about them is they're really powerful because they're poison arrows, right? It does a lot more damage. You just got to be scratched by one of these arrows, and it's going to kill you. All right, that's going to be important for the plot of the story, so keep that in mind. Number 3, and some of these others are not so exciting, so I'm not going to spend as much time on each of them, but he captures the Quranian Hind. This is a boar that he has to track down. It takes him a long time to do it, and this is what the picture is, again, on the left, the boar being brought back to Eurystheus, because he has to prove that he does all these things, and Eurystheus constantly hides from the scary beasts that are brought before him. Sorry, that's a boar. The Erymanthian boar. The hind is a deer. I don't know why I even said it the way I did. That's my mistake. Anyways, the picture on the left is the Erymanthian boar that is brought before him. So the Quranian hind is, again, it's something it takes him a long time to track down. It's a deer that's sacred to the goddess Artemis. Then he's got to clean the Augean stables. This is the most humiliating of all the tasks because he's basically shoveling crap. There are these stables that have never been cleaned by a king by the name of Augeas, and he just has to clean them out, take the shovel and get to work. In your textbook, it says he asked for payment, which he's not supposed to be paid, and because of this, he's disqualified, which is why you have to have an additional labor added on. Both the Hydra and the stables are the ones he is disqualified on. But his solution to cleaning the stables is kind of creative, but it also is a demonstration of his power. He diverts a river and washes right through the stables, and then he puts the river back in its place. So he's not generally known for his intellect. He, every once in a while, will do something that's kind of witty, but in general, his strength is his main characteristic. So kind of an interesting combination of both skills. And then the last one are the Sympholium Birds. He goes to the Sympholian swamp, and he has to get rid of these nuisance pesky birds, which he shoots down with his bow and arrows. Okay, that wraps up his first 6 labors. And then he's off on the world labors. So these are going to progressively get worse and worse, and he's going to start close to Greece, the island of Crete. So here's another bull task. The story of Gilgamesh, right? You have the bull of heaven, which Gilgamesh and Enkidu both kill in the city of Uruk. They save the city of Uruk. The Cretan bull has an entire mythology behind it. The bull of heaven is kind of a lame character in the Epic of Gilgamesh. We don't know very much about it, but the Cretan bull has a really fun story behind it, so I'll give you part of that just because it's fun. But the king of Crete, or Knossos, city in Crete, was a guy by the name of Minos, and Minos was contesting the throne with his brother to see who actually deserves to be king of Knossos, and he asked for a sign from the gods, and the god of the seas, who's also the god of bulls, Poseidon, sends a bull from the sea to him. It's a beautiful white bull. And in gratitude, this is a sign that he is the chosen one as the king, and what he needs to do appropriately would be to sacrifice the animal to Poseidon in gratitude. But he says, this is way too good-looking a bull. I'm going to keep it. And he sacrifices just another average bull from his herd. Keeps this special bull for himself. Of course, the consequence was the gods allowed his wife, Pasiphae, to become unusually attracted to this beast, so much so that she wanted to sleep with the animal and went to the great architect and inventor Daedalus to build for her a cow costume, for the most part, a mechanical cow contraption that she would then enter so that she could sleep with the bull, and she does. The bull gets her pregnant, and she gives birth to a monstrous child that Minos decides to hide away in a maze under the palace, and it's named after him. It's the Bull of Minos, or the famous Minotaur, half bull, half man. So that's what this bull is. This bull is the daddy to the Minotaur. And Heracles captures it, brings it back to Greece, ultimately lets it go. And it shows up in some other stories later. The hero Theseus will eventually capture it and kill it. I believe he kills it later on. But anyways, that's the Cretan bull. So Crete, kind of this first stepping stone on the way out of the Aegean world. This is the big island. If I was to show you a map of Greece, it's the southernmost island in the Aegean world. Then he goes to Thrace, which is up to the north. So first to the south to Crete, up to the north to Thrace. And he has to deal with this really corrupt king by the name of Diomedes, who's trained his horses to eat human flesh. Kind of a trick to get horses to do that. But here's another example of the guest-host relationship and the sanctity of that relationship, because Diomedes welcomes many people to his home, and the custom as a host would be to feed his guests. And I don't know if it's necessarily a joke, but the play on that idea of feeding your guests is the fact that Diomedes twists it where he does feed his guests. He feeds them to the horses. So he is the epitome of the worst possible host, and he deserves exactly what he gets, which is himself being thrown to the horses by Herakles, and then those horses are released. Okay, so poetic justice for Diomedes. Then he goes off to the Far East. Here now he is crossing over to the Amazons. This is a tribe of warrior women located somewhere around the Black Sea region. It's kind of a vague territory. There's no actual historical territory of the Amazons, but kind of this mythical group. But it takes him again on a journey far, far away. This is the beginning of getting close to that Underworld Journey motif, but not quite there yet. He has to go and get the Queen Hippolyta's girdle, her belt, her sword belt, for the most part. And he goes with an army and requests the belt, and she says, okay, no problem. Of course, that's way too easy. So here's Hera, decides to mess things up, try to get him killed by inciting a riot. She comes in disguise as an Amazon woman and says, help, help, the queen is being attacked, and all of the Amazon women come to fight Heracles and his men. And unfortunately, the poor queen is killed in the midst of it, and Heracles gets the girdle anyways. So Hera, again, not just messing up Heracles' life, she's messing up everybody else around her. Not very nice. Anyways, here we got the last three, and all of these three challenges are going to be Underworld Journey. So here's our descent motif. Geryon and his cattle. This is going to take him to the far west. He actually is going to cross the ocean to the land of the setting sun. Again, crossing the body of water is one of the clues that you're going on an underworld journey. Going well beyond the boundary of the world is also the idea, and he's going to go to a very scary place. He takes a boat. The description is, I believe he gets the boat from Helios, but he sails the boat by taking off his lion skin, holding it up like a sail, and then drifting across the waters to Geryon's realm. And if you remember the story of Gilgamesh crossing the waters of death, he, at one point when he runs out of those poles, takes off his cloak and his garment, holds it up as a sail to sail across the waters of death. Again, this is very much the same motif. Okay, so you could see why you could say that Herakles is a version of Gilgamesh. Now, Geryon is a double-bodied monster, and he's got a double-headed dog, and he ultimately kills them, takes the cattle, and brings them back, having victory. Okay, so again, the crossing, by the way, this is the idea of a liminal experience. So he's crossed over and he crosses back. Symbolically, death and return. The 11th task, three bodies, thank you. Geryon is the type of character I can never figure out how an artist would be able to depict that. Thank you. Triple man. Next task is the Apples of the Hesperides. He's going to go now to the other direction, to the Far East. Now, he doesn't go all the way himself, but again, it is very much a journey to the underworld because he's going to the Far East, to the boundaries of the earth, this time to a garden of paradise where you've got these wonderful fruit trees that represent immortality. As a matter of fact, the apples of the Hesperides are the golden apples that were given to Hera as a wedding gift, and they're guarded by these three women, the Hesperides, who happen to be the daughters of the Titan Atlas. And the tree where they grow is guarded by a serpent. So this is kind of like an Eden at the end of the world, right? The very thing man was kicked out of in the book of Genesis after their sin and barred from it by the flaming sword. So here's Herakles going off on the descent motif again. Now, he doesn't make it all the way. He doesn't know how to get to the place, but he does stop by Atlas, who is holding up not the earth, he holds up the heavens. Okay, I know all of the artwork you see of Atlas, he's holding up the earth. One of the reasons that when you want to go and buy a book of maps, it's usually called an atlas. It comes from this story. But he literally is holding the heavens away from the earth. And Atlas says, I know where the garden is. I'll just go for you if you just hold the heavens for me while I be on my way. And Herakles agrees. He says, okay, go ahead. Atlas gets the apples, comes back, comes to Herakles and says, I'm going to do you one more favor. I'm going to actually take these apples all the way back to Eurystheus for you, and you just keep holding those heavens. He didn't want to take them back, as you would imagine. This is a punishment, by the way, for the defeat of the Titans by the gods, by Zeus. So poor guy's been holding these for eternity, or nearly. Herakles, here's an example of kind of quick thinking on his part. He says, I will be happy to hold them for you, and just give me 1 second because it's uncomfortable and I'd like to get a pillow or a cushion for my shoulders. So if you could just take the heavens back temporarily, I'll get the pillow and then I'll be happy to take them right back from you. And Atlas, being one step dumber than Herakles, decides to hold them for a moment, and Herakles goes ahead, picks up the apples, and is on his way. Okay, so he outsmarts the dumb Titan Atlas, having his second conquest over death, right? His second return from the underworld. Finally, we get to the culminating challenge, which is the literal descent into the underworld, and the most important of the 12, where he goes down to capture the three-headed hound known as Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld, which he wrestles into submission because Hades says, you could take the dog with you as long as you don't hurt it, and you bring it right back. And Herakles masters the beast, brings him back, and here's another wonderful vase painting. This one's actually... it's also black figure vase painting, so this is basically archaic era stuff, but you can see the three heads of the beast with these serpents kind of coming off of the character as well. And there's Eurystheus again, hiding in a pot, scared, while Herakles, stands out there holding back the animal by a leash, the dominant hero. Shame, right? This lesser coward, and he's serving him with all these tasks. All right, so cool culmination, but again, the hero can't really be a hero if he doesn't have some kind of ultimate conquest over death, and this is the best way to do it, an actual descent. Now, this is not the only descent, literally, to the underworld. He has other ones, which I'm going to fill you in on a little bit later, but for now, let me just tell you what happens during his trip to the underworld. Actually, on every single one of these tasks, there are little side adventures, so I'm skipping over lots of different stories. I'll give you some of the other stories that I think are important to maybe recap later, but on this one I need to stop for a second. Maybe I should mention one other, since we've already talked about the story of Prometheus. On the trip to the Amazons, since he's going in that direction, he actually passes by Prometheus, and he's partly responsible for freeing Prometheus from his imprisonment on the rock. Okay, so those are the types of things he does that are really fairly significant in mythology. But anyways, while he's in Hades, he comes across a friend of his, and the guy's name is Meleager. Meleager died. I'm trying to remember if he died in it's another boar hunt. I'm forgetting the name of the boar hunt off the top of my head. I believe he was killed on this boar hunt. He's gored by the boar and ends up going to the underworld, where Herakles then encounters him. But he's a friend. I believe he was one of the Argonauts with Herakles earlier on in his life. Now it's going to bother me the rest of the night, the name of the... I'll at some point just probably shout it out. But anyways, Herakles encounters him, and he basically asks Herakles a really big favor. I wouldn't recommend you doing this with your friends if you have a similar situation, though I doubt anybody's going to have a similar situation nowadays. But he says to Herakles, he says, my sister is getting a little bit on in years. She's kind of past the prime of her life, and she has not yet found a husband. So it's appropriate, of course, to marry off the women in the family if you could find a good husband for them. And he says, do me a big favor. When you go back to the upper world, marry my sister. And Herakles, being usually a really good friend, he says, yeah, okay, no problem. I'll do that. So he is going to get married again after he's released from his 12 years. And now that he's completed this last task, he's a free man. He goes off and he marries the sister. Her name is Deianira. Now, I'll talk about this vase painting in a second. This is a very old, archaic vase painting. But anyways, it's going to be relevant to this portion of the story. So again, a good example, here's another story that I have a note on the screen, Admetus and Alcestis. So Meleager is the guy whose sister Deianira is. But there's another story which involves another descent into the underworld and another example of how good a friend Heracles can be. Admetus is a friend of his who is another Argonaut, and Admetus was offered by the gods a chance for immortality. We all know how valuable that is. I mean, Gilgamesh showed us that. Now, the trick is somebody has to be willing to die in his place if he's going to be immortal. So he goes originally to his aged parents and says, Mom, Dad, I know you guys love me. Why don't you want to die for me so that I can be immortal? And they say, yeah, we love you, but, we still value our lives. We're not quite that old yet. We want to keep living for a little while, so no thank you. And he runs out of people after a while of, who to ask. But his wife, Alcestis, is really in love with him. And she says, I am willing to die so that you can have this gift. And she dies, all right? Now, she is recently deceased. The whole household is in mourning, servants and such. And along comes Heracles on one of his, wandering adventures, stops by his friend's house, and Admetus is going to be a good host, welcomes him in, offers him drink, offers him food, tells his servants, don't let on that my wife is dead, don't let him know that the whole house is in a state of mourning, just put on a smile and be a good host. So that's what's going on. And of course, as the night goes on, they're talking, they're eating, they're drinking. Heracles is getting a little bit drunk, which he often does, and he's a little bit loud, a little bit obnoxious. And one of the servants comes over to him after a while and says, hey, you need to knock it off. You're acting very, very inappropriate. You have no idea, but the master's wife just died, and we just buried her. Actually burned her because they practice cremation, by the way. And he feels horrible when he realizes what's happened. And to make it up to Admetus, he says, I'm going to do a favor. I'm going to go down to Hades and retrieve his wife, which he does. He goes down and retrieves Alcestis, and there's a reunion between the two of them. So here's another example of a descent into the underworld, a victorious return, and a good friend, right? He's a good guy for the most part. He has his flaws. Friendship is not one of them, okay? So let's talk about some of his flaws. He gets married to Deianira, and shortly after the wedding, he's traveling with her, and they come to a river which needs to be crossed. And it happens to be a time when the river is in a stage of flooding. It's kind of running very deep and fast, and he doesn't want his bride to get wet, but along comes a centaur. So here's the picture on the screen, the centaur by the name of Nessus. I think we've talked about the centaur Chiron, and if I haven't, I definitely will in the past. Chiron is the great example of a civilized centaur. He's a trainer of heroes. He actually has a role in raising Achilles and Jason and various other figures. In fact, he actually takes Prometheus's place on the rock at the end of the Prometheus story. But this character, Chiron, is an unusual centaur. The average centaur is much more like Nessus. They're animalistic, wild, sexual beasts. They represent the wild side of human nature, right? They're half human but half animal. And Nessus apparently presents himself as a civilized creature, comes up to Heracles and Deianira and says, I'm willing to have you put your bride on my back. I'll swim her across the water so she could stay dry, and then you can come swimming after us. And Heracles says, okay, and he puts his wife on, he swims across. Now, Heracles hasn't quite jumped into the river yet when Nessus comes out the other side and sees that he's quite a ways away from Heracles, feels very safe to do what he has intention of doing, which is to rape Heracles' new bride. And he tries to do this. Unfortunately, Heracles, who is no fool and a very good archer, sees what's going on across the river, shoots his arrows across, and kills the centaur before he could violate Deianira. Now, the consequence is going to be pretty bad because I don't know how he pulls this off, but somehow Nessus convinces Deianira to take some of his blood with her. He says his blood has the magical ability to keep somebody faithful. If you think your husband is going to stray from you, use my blood and he will, be forced to be faithful to you. Now, of course, the blood, which has been spilled through the use of those poison arrows, is now tainted with the Hydra's poison. And Deianira has no idea about this, but I don't know where she got the flask from, but she's got a vial. Apparently she's a chemist and she keeps these things on her, like, what's his name in Harry Potter? I'm going to forget all kinds of names tonight, but if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, you know the guy that always keeps the vial with him in case. Anyways, Now I'm going to be thinking about the professor's name. Darn it, I hate this. I'm having a bad night for names. Anyways, she takes the blood with her in secret and goes off. Now, the next thing is exactly what you expect to happen after a scene like that. Herakles, being an adventurous guy, likes to go off and do the heroic stuff. And he's wandering around far from home, and on one of his adventures, he comes to meet a very young and beautiful woman, much younger than his wife, by the name of Iole. No, not Mooney. Not the guy. No, that was Mad-Eye Mooney. No, that's not the one I'm thinking of. He has a flask that he drinks from with the Polyjuice potion, which, again, wasn't actually Mooney. Yeah, dang. It's the other guy. If you remember it, text it. If I remember it, I'll throw it in, but it's hard for me to stop and think while I'm talking, which is why I still haven't given you the name of the boar hunt. The Caledonian boar hunt. There you go. Sorry. I knew it would come to me. Anyways, Iole is a beautiful woman, and he decides he wants her. But the problem is, when he goes and asks for her, he is rejected. The father says, this is the king by the name of Eurytus, he says, "No way am I going to allow you to marry my daughter. I know about your past relationships. You murdered your first wife, you're married currently, and you have, kind of a reputation for being, sleeping with all kinds of women. They're the daughters of Thespius. That's the most notorious example of Herakles' insatiable sexuality. He sleeps with the 50 daughters, I think it's 50, of daughters of Thespius in a single night or something like that, and conceives children. He conceives children everywhere in the world in the myths of Herakles. But when he's refused, Herakles, losing his temper, very true to form, flies off in a rage and slaughters Eurytus, the father, as well as Iole's brothers, who rush in to try to defend their father. Basically, the whole family, with the exception of Iole, is slaughtered by Herakles in his rage. And when he finishes killing them, he now has to go back into exile and do another penance. So he goes back to Delphi to meet with the Pythia. Now, the Pythia at this point, she's the one that assigned him the 12 labors and his name, basically doesn't want to talk to him. She says, enough is enough, I guess. And she turns around and walks into the temple, in which case he flies off into another rage, moves into the temple after her, and seizes hold of the tripod, which was the sacred seat that she sat in. This was the tripod that belongs to the god Apollo. And he drags it from the temple, and lo and behold, Apollo shows up, the god of, music, medicine, archery, and everything else, to fight with Herakles right there at the temple. So there's a battle between Herakles and the god Apollo. It kind of shows you how powerful this guy is. And eventually Zeus just kind of throws a thunderbolt down and breaks him up and says, now's the time. Here's your punishment. You're going to go off for an entire year, which is, I guess, minor compared to what he's already done. But the penance is to serve a queen by the name of Omphale in Lydia. Now, here is why this is worse than the 12 labors, from the Greek perspective. Eurystheus was shameful. Eurystheus was a coward. Omphale, she's not a coward. I mean, you don't expect her to have heroic warrior courage because she's not in that position within society. But the kicker is she's not a Greek. She's a foreign woman. And she is not a king. She's a woman. So this is supposed to be like the most humiliating thing he can do, to serve a foreign woman for a year. And he does it willingly. What makes it even worse is the story tells us that while he's living with Omphale, she loves to have fun with him. And here's a wonderful statue that shows what she does. You can find vase painting and other statues depicting this particular scene. But Omphale, notice, is carrying his club. And if you look on her head, she's got the lion skin that she's wearing. And Herakles is dressed as a woman. And he's got the thread for weaving in his right hand. So she basically switches roles with him for a while, basically makes him her love slave for the year. And he puts up with it and conceives a child with her as well. But ultimately the end comes to the year of his servitude, and he goes off. And he goes back. Oh, here's another example. Sorry, I'm going to fill in the story with one other example of this idea of humiliation and willing to be humiliated. And that's really the key characteristic. There's a story of these little dwarf-like creatures called the Cercopes. It's a fun story. Now, the Cercopes have a a prophecy that because they're troublemakers. These are these little impish characters that play practical jokes on people. And they're warned that eventually you're going to come across a guy who is going to capture you. And the basic prophecy is to beware of the black-bottomed man, whatever that means, because prophecies are always vague. Well, one day they find this character, Herakles, laying down, taking a nap under a tree, and along next to him, his bow and arrows, his club, all his weapons, and they sneak up and they decide they're going to steal his weapons while he's sleeping. Of course, he wakes up and he catches them and he ties them up immediately, and then he hangs them by their feet from his club and kind of slings them over his shoulder, and he goes about his way with them as his prisoners. Now, they're hanging upside down behind him. When they look at him from the back, if you notice, the lion skin doesn't quite cover his body. It drapes down a little ways, but his backside is completely naked. And being an adventurous guy who's always out in the wilderness, getting a lot of sun, he's got a really dark tan on his butt. And they start to laugh. They realize this is the fulfillment of the prophecy. He's the black-bottomed man that they were supposed to avoid. And they start to laugh at him because he looks kind of silly if you think about it with the thing, the lion skin and the tanned butt. And when he finds out that they're laughing at him, he, instead of beating them senseless, as most heroes would do who are being laughed at, he actually laughs at it himself with them. Again, showing his kind of good-natured attitude when he's not flying off into a violent, murderous rage. He's a pretty good-natured guy. But again, this idea of shame and humiliation, he is really willing to endure these things. Anyways, after his year serving Omphale, he returns home. But he returns home with his new possession, Iole, the orphaned princess who he brings back home. And his wife decides, I probably should use the potion to keep him loyal. And she uses the blood of Nessus to coat a garment which he presents him with. Now he has no idea that there's poison, but when he puts it on, the garment sticks to his skin and begins to, like acid, burn into his flesh, and he can't remove the thing. So he's slowly but surely being consumed. Of course, that was not his wife's intention. She had no idea this was going to happen. But, that's the problem when you listen to a centaur. He ends up with a tragic death scene where he builds, he's in such pain, he actually builds his own funeral pyre, climbs up top, and then waits for somebody to light him up. I don't know why he didn't just light it himself, but that's not the way the story goes. He sits up top, and along comes a young kid by the name of Philoctetes. By the way, this is where the character Phil in the Disney cartoon comes from. He's not a satyr. The character Phil in the cartoon is half goat, half man. That's a satyr. It's just a regular guy, Philoctetes, a young man. And he says, will you light the funeral pyre for me and put me out of my misery? And Philoctetes says, I guess I'll do that if you give me something in return. I'd like your bow. And Herakles says, well, sure, no problem. I don't really need that anymore. So he hands him the bow. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, besides it's the end of the story for Herakles as far as his death goes, but the character of Philoctetes is going to come back and be important in the story of the Trojan War. And there's a prophecy related to the fall of Troy, which says, and I'm sure I'll cover this later when we cover the story of Troy in the Iliad. The prophecy is that the city of Troy is not going to fall until the bow of Herakles is brought out onto the battlefield. Now, Philoctetes goes to Troy with the Greek soldiers, but the problem is he never arrives at Troy. They actually abandon him on an island in the very beginning before the war ever breaks out. So you go for 10 years without being able to take the town until they realize the mistake that they made. So Philoctetes is going to be instrumental in the conclusion of the war. So we'll see him later. Right? This is that next generation. He's a kid, and he'll later be a man at Troy. But this is the death. What follows is an apotheosis. An apotheosis, if you remember, is when you have a divinization, the idea of becoming more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Right? It's the Obi-Wan Kenobi scene when Darth Vader strikes him down. Herakles, and this is not uncommon for heroes. Even in the Greek world, lots of heroes were worshipped after their death, and kind of like hero cult. They became minor deities, particularly over various regions, and there are lots of cult activity and shrines set up to these deceased heroes. Very important part about Greek religion. What makes Herakles unique is not that he becomes a god, but that he becomes an Olympian, full-fledged god. Okay, most heroes don't get promoted to quite that level, so he's going to be really, really important as an Olympian. And he gets married one final time. Hebe, I guess this is one bride that he can't kill because she's an immortal daughter of Zeus, kind of a homebody. So he marries one final time and lives happily ever after at the very palace of Hera, again, with the woman who's caused him all this misery. I guess you could say it's a tragic story with somewhat of a happy ending. Yes, she's a cupbearer. Very good. And the other cupbearer, Hebe and Ganymede, are the two cupbearers for Zeus. So good. I love it when you guys know your mythology. You can fill me in when I make mistakes or leave something out. So bravo. Well done. Still trying to think of the name of the professor in the Harry Potter story. Not Snape. No, how dare you? I would remember that name. He's like my favorite character in Harry Potter. This other guy's good too. I mean, he's interesting. He's quirky, but I will remember at some point. So let's keep going because I'm not done with the lecture. Let's talk about the wild versus the civilized. Theme that we keep coming back to. I'm going to keep coming back to these things because I think they're important themes. Gilgamesh, we really looked at the theme in depth there. Herakles, another great example. He is a character who is a monster slayer. So by nature, his task to fight the wild beasts out there to protect civilization in here, that takes a violent and powerful individual, right? The lion, the bull, the dragon. He fights giants. This particular picture is a more modern sketch of his wrestling match with the giant Antaeus. Fun story. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but Antaeus is basically unbeatable as long as he's touching the earth. And Herakles eventually realizes this. He's not able to throw him in the wrestling match until he lifts him off of the ground so he can't touch the earth. And then he crushes him in his arms and defeats him. So there's a number of other battles. He battles the giants even with the gods. Or the Gigantomachy is where he defeats the giants. So you got a lot of these battles. But the other aspect of him, besides being a monster slayer, is the wild side of his attitude or his nature when it comes to his anger issues. Okay? This is going to be a big problem, obviously, for him. So he is out of control, like an animal on one level, but he is also a civilized figure and a cultural hero, which is the next thing that you look at here. He's responsible in the Greek world for all kinds of civilized activity. He's credited with founding the Olympic Games. Supposedly he measured the stadium, all right, the foot race track, the stade, based on the length of his stride. Okay, so the Olympics, which were the most important cultural event in the ancient Greek world, was credited with, to Herakles. Various Greek colonies made him their patron. He was supposedly one who founded many cities. A lot of royal houses within the Greek world traced themselves back to Herakles. Remember, he slept with all those women and fathered all these children all over the place. So all these places claim Herakles is our ancestor. And it's probably the fact that people were doing this, trying to tie themselves historically back to this great hero of the past, that is why you have a development of so many stories about him sleeping everywhere, because everyone in Greece wants to be a son of Herakles. The other interesting story is with Laomedon. This is really has to do with the saving of Troy, and this is kind of a setup for the Trojan War. I'll just give it to you briefly here. I may talk about it later. But Laomedon's the king of Troy. Herakles actually saves the daughter Hesione from a sacrifice, rescues her from the monster that she's being sacrificed to, kills the monster, and then would like a reward from Laomedon, the king of Troy, and refuses. Laomedon, as a result, when he refuses to pay Herakles his reward, is killed by Herakles. He goes off into another rage. As a matter of fact, he kills the entire royal house of Troy, except for the youngest son, which is this boy by the name of Priam, and puts Priam essentially on the throne of Troy. So Priam is going to be the king during the Trojan War. So here's an example of him, interacting with various cities, founding various cities, but also that negative, angry attitude that cost the death of Linus and his first wife and Iole's family, and now Laomedon and the household of Troy. He kills so many people in the world that it's a problem for his domestic side, right? So those are all the characters that I just listed. But when it comes to finding that balance, like Gilgamesh did, right, where he becomes civilized by the end of the story, the same way Enkidu becomes civilized so he could fit into Uruk. And part of that civilizing is giving up that wild side, giving up the strength and ferocity. Enkidu becomes weak. Herakles doesn't get the balance just right. He is violent and it doesn't translate into the domestic side of life. He is incredibly successful on the battlefield and fighting with beasts. He is a miserable failure when it comes to his relationship and family life. Okay, so here's that duality again that's always being investigated in these stories. What is a hero? What does it take? How does one attain that proper balance, right? The duality in human nature that needs to be resolved. Now let's talk about one more theme. And this is the idea of him being a suffering and humble servant, right? The idea of servant, obviously, is a humble title. Now, if you've ever heard the term suffering servant before, I have a guess where you may have heard it. I'm going to bring it up in just a second. The background, again, is a picture of that same shot of the character Cerberus being brought before Eurystheus as he hides in that pot. Humiliating, shameful, cowardly individual. And here's the great Herakles serving him willingly. Right? He's on a quest for glory for the most part. He's going to build a name for himself, and that name comes by willingly enduring the hardship, as it's been assigned to him, right? He realizes he deserves penalty, and he willingly endures it. And that involves choice, right? He could live a life of pleasure. He could assert his superior power everywhere he goes, but he chooses not to do that, right? It's when he loses control that he does the rage thing. When he's in control, he does the humility, humble thing, right? He does the shameful thing. So there's this idea, and for him, like I said, it's appropriate. He is willing to endure these things, and in enduring these things, he ultimately wins for himself a really great fame, right? And that's his immortality. I mean, literally, he's immortal in that he is raised as a god, but his name is going to live on, right? He's the greatest of the Greek heroes. And that's really important. Now, the reason I brought up this title, Suffering Servant, is an interesting phenomenon in history and really weird when you think about it. He becomes really important as a Christian symbol in early Christianity. And there's been a lot written about this as well. Even on through, like I said, the Roman era. Christianity, right, is born in the 1st century A.D., and then eventually comes to dominate the Roman Empire by the 4th century. It's legalized, made the official religion by the end of the 4th century, and then has, shaped basically the whole path of medieval Europe afterward. So it's weird that early Christians, who are monotheistic and are very opposed to the polytheism of the Greek and Roman world, would embrace a figure like Herakles, who's clearly a pagan figure, right? The son of a god Zeus. Why did they do that? Why does he become such an important Christian symbol? And it links back to this quality, the idea that he is a figure who not only conquers death, very much like a Christ figure, but he is also a suffering servant, a humble servant, which is reminiscent of Christ. If you don't know much about the New Testament, the figure of Jesus in the New Testament is referred to as a suffering servant, right? He washes his disciples' feet. He goes to his death willingly for others. All right, that whole idea was core to Christian values, and they see this paralleled in Greek mythology, so they embrace the character, which is really interesting. Okay, so very, very important, like I said, not just as a Greek hero, but as a hero who is a world hero, the most important Greek hero, bar none. I am just waiting for them to actually make a decent Herakles movie at this point. So I'm not going to keep my fingers crossed. Obviously, I'm not going to expect Disney to do it because the story, as you have seen, is completely inappropriate for children under a certain age. But that wraps up Herakles. Next time, we're going to be moving on. We're going to stick with the Greek world for just a little while longer. Actually, we're going to be dealing with the Greek world for several other sessions. But next week, or next session, we're going to be taking a look at the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. And Herakles is going to make a special guest appearance. But that's where we're going to go next time. So for next time, please read the story so we could have fun discussing Jason and the Golden Fleece.